Hello, all, and welcome. We'll get started in just a moment. Thank you for joining us today for today's session. I'm going to wait until the top of the hour rolls in, and then we'll get started with a little housekeeping, some announcements, and into today's content. For those of you early birds, if you'd like to chat with us, I'm in the chat. I should be able to see both your chats and your questions. Feel free to throw those in there, and I'll try to get back to them during the course of today's discussion. Right. And then we're seeing some more folks join us. Thank you to those of you that just arrived. And I think we can get started with a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you again, if you haven't heard me say it enough. My name's Josh Straley. I'm going to be the moderator for today's discussion on higher ed data management, how simplifying processes and improving experiences work specifically in the higher education space. Forgive me. We'll get into today's agenda. First, I'd like to just do a little housekeeping, introduce our panel, then we'll get into our discussion, and it'll be wide-ranging. We're going to talk about some challenges specific to higher education with our panelists. We're going to talk about how they go about improving student experiences. We'll also dig into some of the data and how you can report and achieve better analytics, specifically through your CRM and forms. And then we'll open things up for questions. So please, as we go through today's conversation, use the Q&A module if you'd like to get some questions in front of our panelists. They may be able to answer while we're discussing if they're great multitaskers, but either way, we'll save some time at the end of today's session to get those questions answered for you. And as always, jump into the chat. I'll be monitoring that and answering when I can. You might hear me ticking away on my keyboard. I'll try and stay in contact with you as well. Speaking of today's panel, I am joined by my friends Brian Karsinski and Tom Kelleher. Gentlemen, good day.
Good afternoon.
Hey there.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking some time away from your own busy schedules to join us today. Really looking forward to discussing things with you. I did skip a slide. The audience will notice. I want to go back very quickly. I'm from Form Assembly. If you haven't heard of us, we're a data collection platform that serves many different verticals, but we are especially well suited for the higher education space. We have a seamless Salesforce integration that makes it really easy for the universities and colleges that use us to keep Salesforce as their source of truth while also offering students delightful form experiences that meet their expectations for digital experiences in today's current age. But we also make that easy to do. We've got simple tools that anyone can use, or also high code tools that allow Salesforce admins with a bit of technical experience to build the processes that they need at their universities. We love seeing how higher ed institutions use Form Assembly to improve data collection at their institutions. We love seeing better student experiences with data collection. We love seeing how forms can help can help universities communicate with their student bodies, their staff, their faculty, all across the life cycle of, from applicants all the way to alumni. And so we sponsor webinars like today's session because we want to inspire you to have better data solutions at your organization. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. Before we get started with our first panel question, I'm going to ask Kate to pop up a poll for the audience. And audience, we'd love to hear from you. Before we start talking about the challenges that Brian and Tom have seen in their time in the higher education space, I want to hear what challenges you've been seeing. This will give our panelists and myself an idea of where your institution is at, where you are at with your own data collection. So we'll give you just a few moments to give it a click and an answer there. Spoiler alert, I think we're going to be talking about almost all of these challenges on today's webinar. So if you are experiencing any of these, I think we're going to touch on how at least our panelists have seen, these solutions and challenges solved. And Kate, we'll give it about 5 more seconds, and then I'd love to see the results. I'm very interested to see what our audience is thinking today, if you don't mind closing that poll. All right. This is probably not a surprise to, well, it's not a surprise to me. Brian and Tom, I'd love to hear, before we even get started on our first kind of question here, I'd love to hear whether you're surprised by this. Most of our audience is seeing manual and time-consuming, specifically data corrections, taking up their time, but then also struggling with outdated systems and lack of integrations. Does that surprise either of you?
Not in the least, to be honest. Probably comes as no surprise to anyone here. But I think what I'm still seeing, even in 2025, is that you still have that full range, right? You still have people who are doing everything manually and they're struggling with that, and all the way to you've got politics and individual sort of data fiefdoms on campuses that really lead into that sort of issue with duplication of data and quality of data.
I love the idea of a data fiefdom. It sounds a lot more ornate than a silo, but absolutely. I mean, whenever I talk to universities, it seems to be that no matter how data focused or data central they are, there's still pockets that they can't touch or see. Brian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing it a lot as well, where, we'll start working with a group and we kind of do a little discovery before we even meet with them, right? We go out on their website, we poke around a little bit, and you'll see PDF forms still. You'll see some web forms, but they're not actually connected anywhere, and they're just going to a back end of a WordPress and other places. And so it's if someone has progressed to collecting data in a form, it's usually not connected actually to a CRM,
Mm.
which helps out a little bit. It's better than a paper form or a PDF, but there's still a lot of improvement that can happen in most all the groups that come to us.
Right, that's a great point. Just because a data collection process is digital doesn't mean that it's connected. But that is a bit better than having to go ruffling through a file cabinet somewhere. Let's get started with our first question today. Tom, from Attain Partners, when you're working with your higher ed clients in your space, what are the big challenges that you're seeing in 2025? And how are how are you addressing it with your clients?
Yeah, I think it really sort of comes back to that last point, in that today I think we often get caught up with some of the buzz around things like AI. And it's all very exciting. But I'll sort of age myself slightly and I go with the older analogy now of boxed software, right? Many institutions that I engage with are frankly still looking for that piece of boxed software that they can pull off the shelf that will, solve their problem. And AI is sort of playing into that. There are lots of companies that are now offering very specific AI tools that may even be so specific to this particular vertical. But it comes back to the basics for me. So, uh, as Brian said, every time I meet with a new client, we do some investigations. We're going to spend some time talking about what is it you're trying to solve and where are you hiding all of the skeletons and all of the things like that. But putting the cart before the horse, right? Everyone's like, oh, we want to do a data lake, we want to do AI. That's great, but if you're still collecting PDF forms, um, we have to start at the beginning, and that journey is going to take some time. So it's really a lot of the issues I see are still a lot of the basic questions that we were asking 5 years ago that still have to be answered.
Yeah, foundational, if I can give it
Yeah.
another. And I don't want to say that I'm not surprised. It's been several years since my own higher ed experiences, but I have gotten the sense with the universities that I work with as a part of Form Assembly that there's not swift change when it comes to technology at universities. They are oftentimes dealing with systems that were established many years ago, and they work. So it's been difficult for them to prioritize complete rip outs or rehabs. But that doesn't mean that they're not dealing with every day, the consequences of some outdated systems. Brian, down in University of Florida, what challenges are you guys tackling this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a public university, right, there's always resources, there's always a question. And so there's, as Tom was saying, there's so much innovation and so much going on that it kind of can be paralyzing a little bit to think about all of it and want to do too much, as opposed to really just kind of, do you have your business processes mapped out? You know, are you, what do you want to do? We don't want to just lift whatever process you have and move it over. And some of that foundational stuff, it's a struggle for us to find groups who have time to do that, right? They often come to us and they'll say, hey, we want to automate this. Um, and there's not, they don't have their business process mapped out. Um, Automating something is, not as easy as just saying it, right? If you're automating something, you're doing it off of, data changing in your systems. And if that's not happening consistently, you're going to be sending emails or you're going to be, sending out information that shouldn't be sent. So we try and evaluate, a group and see what their capacity is, where they're at. If they're at a very basic point, we kind of start with the basics, and then say, hey, we can do X, Y, Z, but we need to start here because this is the time you have, and we can grow, and it can be a future phase that we get to. But I think a lot of groups see the flashy stuff and want to do that, but there's really just a lot of foundational stuff that needs to be put in place first to get there.
No, absolutely. Form Assembly actually conducted a survey, not of in the higher ed space specifically, but of data professionals, Salesforce admins, CRM roles in the last quarter of last year. And one of the things that everyone recognized was that there was room for automation to improve their efficiency at their organization. What they struggled with was how to automate because they throwing a new tool at the situation didn't necessarily solve the issue. In fact, another data handoff usually resulted in some more errors or some formatting issues, and they were really struggling with that. We'll be putting out a report on that survey data within the next month, but I found that fascinating. It was across industries where it was like, we know we need to automate more, but we're really struggling with that because every time we automate something, it seems like my team ends up with more manual corrections to do every week, which is, not ideal. That's the counterbalance. Um,
Yeah.
you Brian, you specifically mentioned, there's a lot of technology out there. Technology comes with costs. Tom mentioned the box software, the perpetual licenses that have kind of like gone by the wayside in most software verticals. Software costing money. Here's my current events topic. Has any of the uncertainty around federal funding in the higher ed space, specifically public universities, has that had any impact on how schools are looking at technology this year? And Brian, I'd love to start with you with this one.
Yeah, so I mean, our enterprise org, I'm in central IT. We have about 1,100 users, and that spans 40 different groups where customers of our users are students, applicants, but also faculty and staff in offices like the CFO's office and research. So we're actually kind of seeing groups come to us wanting to bring more into Salesforce to kind of create more efficiency, but then also they know what they can report on now. And so getting that data and the analytics out of Salesforce, knowing where the data collection is coming from, right? That's actually kind of appealing to them because they're needing to, report on what staff and users are doing in Salesforce. They need to report on volumes year over year. What departments and what colleges across the university are, have cases. Are those volumes increasing every year? What does the workloads look like? So we've actually kind of, in the short term, gotten groups to reach out to us to work on dashboards and reports to show that type of data. We do a customer satisfaction score in our cases. So we've kind of found that some of the stuff in the current climate that is being asked for, Salesforce actually is helpful with providing that data.
No, fascinating. So that focus on efficiency and proving, being able to track and prove, the use of software is actually helping. That's very interesting. Tom, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So, I got my start in higher ed many years ago now, working for California State University. And I would say, coming back to your point about federal funding today, I think it's interesting because if we think back, well, within that decade, right? Even a little bit more, we have a history here that I think influences just as much where we are today. So we came out of the '08 recession, and there were obviously impacts financially to many institutions. I remember quite well that the dean I was working for at the time was very much very good at the fiscal responsibility piece, right? So we kind of got through that crisis comfortably, if you will. But a lot of those issues didn't go away, right? So a lot of people have been talking about things like the enrollment cliff that we've all been sort of, watching for a number of years. And now we've got this federal funding question. But even sort of coming back to the CSUs, um, in my experience at least, there's a lot of data that was left untapped by many institutions that could have helped or could help today in sort of addressing some of these concerns, whether it's budgetary or otherwise. These are, data-driven decision making is something we've all been talking about for a long time. And there's mountains of data that these institutions are sitting on that really could um, make a significant difference, not just today in some of the challenges we're seeing, but long term as well.
Yeah, so I love that. I'd love to hear a little bit more, actually. Do you think do schools have the tools to, especially when it comes to enrollment, tap into the student voice and understand, why maybe students are choosing not to enroll when we thought they would coming out of high school? Are they, like, do they have their ear to the ground and are they able to kind of like learn from, to your point, the data that they're sitting on? Because I know they're listening to their students, but can they make decisions from that data?
In my experience, they have the tools more often than not. They have very talented data scientists available to do this work, but there isn't enough time in the day or resources more generally, right? Particularly on like a technology side of things, to bring that data together in a productive way and in a clean way, right? Because that sort of leads you down a conversation of things like a data lake or a warehouse. Um, in my experience, at least, these are hurdles that many institutions have yet to tackle.
Mm. Brian, I know you've seen some success on reporting and kind of like making data very visible at your organization. Do you think that schools broadly have the tools that they need to surface data, find insights, or are they lacking at all?
I mean, I think it's challenging for Salesforce data. There's obviously reports and dashboards and some other capabilities, but then, Salesforce always isn't always the best tool for reporting as well, right? We have some instances where we push out our Salesforce data out to our data lake, and it's combined with Canvas data and PeopleSoft data, and that's really where some of the data scientists get into building out, you know, things in Tableau and other tools and whatnot. And not everyone has that ability, right? We're lucky with our enterprise org that we can push that data out, and we're working with the groups like Student Life and the Office of Research, where they have staff who know how to do that work and pull that data. So it kind of depends, right? Where's the best place to report and visualize that data? Certainly not always Salesforce, but then you have to have the people and the tools, and like Tom said, the time to put that all together. So on our end, if we can have it if we have it in Salesforce, that's obviously the best place. But there are various use cases that we have now where it just kind of gets more complicated, and we push the data out to the data lake and let the team in UFIT who works on that kind of build out those reports and dashboards.
Okay, nice. Well, but the solution's there, just not always in
Yeah.
sales. That's good to hear. Um, On to something that, our audience told us at the beginning that integration was one of the issues that they were seeing, challenges with. And Brian, you just mentioned, like you're able to at your org, push the data where you need it to go. Sound well integrated. When you have dealt with a system that didn't integrate well, how did you address that? Was there a common strategy that you've used to make sure that things were as simple as being able to move data around to the places where reporting was easier?
For us, I mean, we're kind of stringent in some ways, right? When we bring a group on, we're gonna bring them in and they're gonna use form assembly for their form builder. We still have, groups that will use other tools and they can send an email summary of whatever form that was submitted and it'll create a case. But that's not going to be as robust as, filling out a form assembly form that's behind single sign-on and we can map fields and records. So we, on our team, our Salesforce team, it doesn't really impact us too much. We just kind of explain the pros and cons of, using a form assembly form versus whatever other, whether it's manually inputting things, and really give that group a decision of saying, hey, these are the pros and cons. You can, if you like your other form that's out there and it's working for you, that's fine. Usually the decision is to come to form assembly and we'll build out a form for them. But we leave it up to our users in the end to decide.
Nice. I love, between the two of you, you both look at these things like problems to solve. Like even for inside of your organization, for these units, you're almost functioning as a consultant there, Brian. I love that. You're both problem solvers. I think that gives you a really good perspective for this panel. Tom, have you seen any, like with integration challenges when you've like worked with a client? I know that student information systems often come up as something that a broad category that doesn't integrate well with things like Salesforce all the time. Do you have any recommendations that you continue to bring to clients when it comes to, we have something in this system, we can't integrate it? Any recommendations that you use all the time?
I think the genuine answer is going to be governance is probably the most important conversation to have. Doing the kind of work I do, I'm often brought in to implement a very specific solution. That could be non-traditional kind of shopping cart experiences. That could be recruitment. It could be admissions. Um, when we hit integration challenges, it's usually because a department wants access to something someone else owns on campus, and there's all kinds of reasons why, you can't push data to the SIS, or you can't collect payments because it has to go into our ERP. There's all kinds of challenges with some of that, which is why I think it's really important to just, if you're going to make these investments, sit down with your peers across campus and have a genuine conversation about how we can best access and move this data around. Because at the end of the day, you're all really supposed to be solving the same problem, right? It's supposed to be institutional data. You're supposed to be there for the benefit of the student. So getting into these sort of squabbles about, oh, it's my SIS, or you can't do this or that, really is counterproductive. So that's where we typically would hope to have conversations around things like data cloud, or a data lake, data warehouse, because then you start to begin to break down that sort of next barrier, to sort of start solving some of these questions. And at least where I'm finding things today, that shouldn't necessarily mean you have to absorb everyone into a single monolithic org if
Hmm.
that doesn't fit the campus, right? The institution. There are tools today around things like DevOps that can help simplify that experience so that you can still control the security and the ownership of data, in accordance to, say, the registrar or the institution's policies, but allow smaller departments to still have the freedom that they need to be able to use institutional data in a productive way.
No, I love that. There are realities at, well, all organizations, but especially in higher ed, that even when an institution is trying to be data focused and make data-driven decisions, there is still it's difficult the larger the organization, it becomes more difficult to all kind of like move in the same direction, to all have, single ownership, because we have to recognize that there are politics involved, and there are different departments and different department heads, and yeah, I think one of the themes that I've heard out of higher ed in the last couple of years is we all recognize that if we pulled together in a single direction, that there are opportunities around data, better decisions, like better access. But it has been tough, I think, for organizations, pardon me, for institutions to find the right leader at an institution to drive that change across a whole university. But it's definitely something I keep hearing. We had a question before we move on from the integration question. Sherry asked in the chat, what are your thoughts on using APIs as a tool to aid in data transfer rather than manual entry? Do either of you have a strong opinion on APIs in general?
Yeah, for us, where our preference when we're integrating Salesforce is to really push the data out to our data lake. That way, there's a separate team here in UFIT that works on security and the data governance, who has access to that data. And then also we're setting up, we're setting it up in a location where there could be other people who could access that, as opposed to going, say, from Salesforce to Slate and things like that in PeopleSoft. So that's kind of our model. We tried to avoid manual entry at all costs. And form assembly plays obviously a big part in that as well.
Yes, I mean, not to insert ourselves in the conversation, but Sherry, one of our favorite things is, making it simpler for organizations, not necessarily to have to use an API, but to actually use, we build connections that we think are better than having to work with an API, although we do support webhooks as well. So that's one of our main use cases, especially in higher ed. Tom, forgive me for cutting you off. Any thoughts on using APIs in general?
I'll give you the really annoying consulting answer, which is it depends, right? I couldn't agree more with what Brian said there. There are instances where there are considerations around how you can access certain data and what you're doing with it, that could make that fine, right, for your solution. But from a CIO perspective, I would much rather you're putting that data into a warehouse or a lake or a data cloud if any of the AEs are hiding, right? Um, these are the places where where data needs to live today. If you're ever going to kind of, again, break that sort of next barrier into things like AI, it probably isn't going to help you if you've just API'd something into your org, because now you're hoarding data again, which is not helpful for the wider institution and ultimately the constituent, right?
Right, right. And I think I think formatting of data and the consistency of that formatting is going to come very into focus over the next couple of years as organizations try to adopt AI, which is going to require pristine data, complete data. I think we're going to hear a lot more of that over the next year. I don't, we could talk all day about the challenges of data collection in the higher ed space. There's more. And I think we're going to get some questions in our Q&A about that as well. I'd love to change our topic for a moment and start talking about, like the customer in the higher ed space, the student. Let's talk about their experiences when it comes to data. In your opinion, panel, if you're looking at the number of forms that students are expected to fill out as a part of their life cycle, right? From initial like application and enrollment on through their time at an institution, do you have any suggestions on how you can reduce that number and offer them more of a streamlined experience? Tom, I'll start with you. I love to tap people.
Sure. So I was starting to feel like a little bit of a broken record, right? But in terms of like reducing some of those barriers for the student experience, it's about using the data you have access to, right? If you know their first name and they've logged in to fill in a form, I don't know, to meet with someone or something, why are you asking them for their first name and last name again? You already have that, right? I can just hear the marketing folks going, "Oh, I just want an RFI form with the first name, last name, and email." Everyone wants fewer form fields. So if you're going to start to bring down some of these barriers, you just need to focus on what do you need to answer right now? What do they need to tell you? And if you can find everything else that you might need, the name or email, then you should pull that from, again, data lake, data warehouse, data cloud, because you shouldn't have to ask that question twice.
Right, that's a great point. It's not even just the number of forms, it's the information you're asking them. Why do you need it again? And
Right? Because
yeah.
if you flip it, right, and I say from a staff perspective, if I have access to all the data and I sit down in front of my console to figure out how I'm helping this student, then I also want the data that should be in a data lake or a warehouse, because then I know the full context to help them, whether that's LMS or a form they filled in for withdrawals that should have triggered a case or something. It's all about access to the data and how you're using it to reduce some of these barriers.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. And I see Rosita in the audience agrees as well. Redundancy, I think that's something that we'll call our students like digital citizens now. They're going to have less tolerance for repeated requests for the same information because they're getting, modern experiences elsewhere whenever they, interact with an Amazon.com, their retail websites. Brian, have you seen any success in streamlining student experiences?
Yeah, one of the most beneficial things we have done is put our forms behind single sign-on. And so, a student and also faculty and staff, right, they're used to using their credentials to log into all of the enterprise systems. So Form Assembly is just another platform to them where they're signing in. And we know who they are, right? At that point, we use the pre-fill connector. We look their record up in Salesforce because we have everyone in there. We tie it to the case. We tie it to any other records that we have. And a lot of times when we start these projects with groups, we'll bring up the existing form. And again, they're asking for first name, last name. They're asking for their UFID. They're asking what program they're in, what year they're in. And it's like, we don't need any of that. We often essentially cut a form in half, if not more, a lot of the times. And then if we're using something like a dynamic lookup, we could potentially do even more, sophisticated things with that. So that's been really a big game changer for us. Just it reduces the amount of fields, but it's also, for most of our forms, we're using the same template. So whether the student is, seeing an academic advisor or they're also a student worker and they're contacting payroll about their paycheck, that form is going to be a similar look, a similar feel, and they're going to not have to fill in things that we know about them already. So that's been a real help for us.
Yeah, and that's a great point. We ridiculed redundancy a bit ago, but there is something to be said about trusting a form, familiarity with a form experience. Like if a student, visits a school website, they should recognize that, oh, this is where my institution, this is how they ask questions. This is what the forms typically look like. So there is a familiarity aspect that is nice, and they should know that their ID can, unlock portions of their data. If they're entering in a form, they can pre-fill information based on their student ID and not have to answer some of those more redundant fields. I love that. That's one of my favorite uses of form assembly is that go-between between the Salesforce CRM data and a form, and making it super simple to use the data that you already have and pre-fill the form, saving the student time. But also there's a quality aspect here as well, where I don't want to say that we don't trust our form respondents, but you give them an opportunity to type their email address 50 times. 49 times it's going to be correct, and the 50th time they're going to have an extra L in there, and you might end up with a duplicate contact, which I know we're going to be covering in our Q&A. Speaking of students, not just offering them great experiences, I'd love to know, have either of you seen issues at schools with like completing forms? I know some forms at an institution like an RFI can be very, very short, but when you start getting into application, when you start getting into course selection, you start seeing more complex forms that are a bit longer. Have you seen any strategies that work for increasing completion rates on these forms that make sure that students stay engaged with them? Brian, maybe I'll start with you for this one.
Yeah, we're doing some stuff on the recruiting side and then sort of the customer service side where we're just, that RFI example, right? It's everyone we meet with wants, 20 fields on that form, right? So we talk to them and say, how about we actually, ask for 3, and then we'll have a lead record in Salesforce and we can set up a follow-up whenever you want. Or even if they're really adamant, maybe we'll, have 2 forms. The first one with 3 fields will auto submit, it'll create the lead record, and then it'll take you to a longer form. And if they fill that out, great. If not, you still have their basic contact information, and you didn't deter someone with your 20 questions. And then we have the customer satisfaction survey where it's essentially just a one-click survey for customer satisfaction, and it redirects to a longer survey. So if they don't want to fill out another 5 questions, that's fine. We still know 1 through 5 how someone did, and we collect that and create a record in Salesforce. So for those examples, we're using, we're really kind of auto submitting the first form and kind of throwing it to a second one, or at least, building out processes in Salesforce after we create that lead record to then come back and, maybe put them in a journey or whatnot to collect more data afterwards.
Oh, that's very interesting. Kind of cutting and running with the data that you've got, and segmenting that form experience where it's like, okay, you've answered some questions. Here's a longer experience. Whether you move forward or not, I have some of the information I already needed. I love that, and I think we will have time to take a look at that CSAT operation a bit later in the webinar. Tom, any strategies that you've seen, specifically around getting the data that you need out of students?
Yeah, using recruitment as the example again, I think we've sort of touched on it here a few times, but it really sort of comes down to often what I see is sort of meeting the students where they are, right? It is not the same kind of marketing environment or just the general recruiting environment that it was 10 years ago, right? As you said, Josh, students are expecting a certain experience these days. And I would sort of qualify that by saying just about a week ago, I was scrolling through Reddit, if anyone is also on Reddit, and I saw some high school students talking about the institutions they've been admitted to. And they were comparing welcome packages for what it was worth. So you're talking snail mail, what do you get in the mail once you've been accepted, right? And what I find interesting in that is if you think about recruitment as a broader journey, right? You shouldn't have to ask the same questions twice in order to increase that completion rate on some of this recruitment information. Because if you think about it more broadly at the start of the journey, it might have been a high school junior or sophomore that indicated that they were interested in computer science. Well, now I know that, right? So the next time I send them, I don't know, an invitation to come for campus for an open house, I can use that again, and I can just focus on, hey, when are you available to come in? I know who you are. I know how to communicate with you. I know what you were interested in. Here now is a special invitation from a journey, maybe Marketing Cloud or something, that says, hey, this professor from computer science would love to give you a tour at this date and time. Can you just let us know when you're available? Right? And if you follow that through the entire recruitment journey, only ever focusing on what's next, what do I need next? By the time you get to that giant one-page application, you can start whittling down the things that you don't need anymore, because you've got that a year or two, maybe, if you had the resources to go through a campaign like that, where you can really focus on that. So that by the time you get to the end of it all, they've applied, they're a button seat, as we might say. Um, Hopefully they're not going to Reddit complaining about the package they received in the mail, because they've had this experience with you. They started to understand your culture, and what they did get in the end, they would be happy with as part of that broader journey.
Yeah, I love that. And Mohammed in the chat has mentioned, being human centric, being student centric in here,
Mm.
letting that kind of guide your data collection process there, where it's like, what do we need from them again? What do we already have? But then also, it's a conversation. That's a great way to view it, where it's like, hey, I already know enough about you. The next question I want to ask is, when can you come in? I think that feels very natural, and I think that, well, obviously our audience agrees. I want to revisit something that we talked about a little bit earlier, and it's, information that the schools can get from students. Have either of you seen a student feedback process that you thought is really well architected, that is, like answering any questions that a university might have, be it about, professors, departments, enrollment processes, welcome packages, any feedback process that you thought was, good?
Yeah, I'll name drop, I suppose, because I was very fortunate a number of years ago to work with UMass Lowell. And one of the things I found particularly interesting about them was they had a process at the time that if you went online and you needed to fill in a form for withdrawing from a course, right? That form, which I believe was form assembly for what it's worth, triggered cases automatically. So in terms of, that student experience, they've got a question. In this case, maybe they were just looking at the form, right? Maybe they partially filled it in. Maybe you also have indicators in Salesforce that tell you, oh, this person is doing so hot in, linear algebra or whatever fun class they're decided to take. So again, using the data that you've got, when the student has given you that indicator, they've asked the question, maybe it's on knowledge, they've maybe submitted that withdrawal form. It's about being proactive, right? I think Mohammed said it right, that human-centric kind of holistic experience of the entire institution, right? Breaking down that kind of sneaker net, right? Where you've got to fill in the form and then walk half a mile across campus to give it to someone else to get a signature to walk back, right? You're breaking down those barriers. You're meeting the students where they are so that before they've even sort of actively put their hand up, right? You've used the data that you have to meet them where they are.
I love that. And Tom, it's funny you mentioned those processes that require those trips across campus. I have a friend Shelly in the audience from Stanford, and one of the processes that she has architected specifically for students with disabilities allows them to handle, some of their data collection, some of their forms without having to make those enormous cross-campus trips. Allowing them to get the information to their advisors that they need without having to worry about, especially for people with disabilities, those walks across campus, they can be challenging. So yeah, it's important to think about your audience there. Brian, this might actually be a good time to ask you to share your CSAT process. I know that it's not necessarily student focused, or maybe there are units that use it for students, but it's an elegant system that you've kind of mentioned. Do you have time to show us that?
Yeah, I'll just sort of set it up a little bit. So we do on the student side have a survey that goes out after an academic advising appointment. So there's roughly, yeah, I think 150,000 of those that end up going out. And what that has in common with the customer satisfaction is it's the same survey. And that's one of the nice things that we accomplished many years ago. Our enterprise org is about 7 years old now. We would meet groups and everyone wanted to do their own survey. And there's lots of lots of downsides to that in all aspects, not just the technical. So we've had some success in having one survey, right? Because some students go to different advising offices. So they're getting that same survey no matter what advising office they go to. And then also for the customer satisfaction, there's about 20 different units that are using it now, and it's again, the same survey. So there's that consistency when data is compared, but then also from a user experience standpoint as well. Um, so yeah, I can share my screen here.
I might need to give you the screen. Let me stop
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah, so I can talk through a little bit here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So we, people do not like surveys all the time, especially when it comes to you contact someone and you're done and they send you another email with a survey. So what we did is kind of implement a little bit of a passive survey is what you're seeing here, where it's an HTML snippet in the user signature of Salesforce users. So we have about 700,000 cases a year. So there's a lot of volume, but it's passive, right? You are a customer, you're getting an email from a user from a case. You don't have to rate them. You can click 1 through 5, essentially, very satisfied to not satisfied. And we collect that and create a Salesforce record tied to the case. You're seeing that here. You'll see the survey response record that's tied to the case. And so our customers like this because it's not really invasive. Someone kind of opts in if they want a voluntary survey, and we collect that one click and create a record. So there's some records we just have a 1 through 5, and that's it. And then the longer survey that you see here getting filled out, that's optional. The first one just redirects to that. And if that longer survey is filled out, it'll update the record um, with more detail from that shorter survey. And the nice part of this is we have all this data in Salesforce, right? So it's instant. The leadership and the users who are having surveys filled out on them, there's dashboards they can go into and they can look and see. And we know from the case who that Salesforce user is. So the survey is tied to a case, it's tied to a user. If that case is tied to a contact, it's a pretty good indicator that that person may be filling it out. So it's worked well, especially in these days where groups are focusing a little bit more on customer service and just, are they doing a good job? And some of that is getting filtered back up to leadership. It's been a nice solution for us.
No, that's fantastic. The first time you showed me that, it's so simple, and yet, you also gave me a glimpse at the dashboard where you're able to just start comparing the trends across all of those. I think you said more than 20-ish units, and their individual CSATs.
Yeah, and
Um,
everyone's a little scared to implement it. But the reality is their customer satisfaction score is always higher than they think it's going to be, and they've never had one before. So we also tell groups, right? It's not fair to compare yourself. If you're in payroll services, you shouldn't compare yourself to financial aid, right? It's two different groups. But what you can do is you could set that baseline that first year, and then that's what you want to improve on year to year, right? And if that goes down from year 3 to 4, then that's something to look into. So we're slowly making some progress with winning people over with that, and once we get it into one group and they start passing that up through their leadership, then leadership starts to ask like, hey, why aren't the other units using it? So it's worked well for us so far.
You're answering my next question already, Brian. And the question is, do you feel like universities, and maybe specifically leadership, but are they getting better at seeing the value of a single source of truth and adopting it? Or do you think they're getting better at data visibility when they see things like, oh, these CSAT reports, I wish I could see these everywhere? Like, is there that momentum that's heading in the right direction?
I think so. I mean, we had a group that was using another form builder that's out there. It's more for surveys, and they were, collecting it there, but then it's separate. It's not tied to cases. We've seen a lot of
Mhm.
groups who will come to us for a second, third, fourth phase of work because they want to get out of a spreadsheet. It's really blunt, but sometimes we'll show up and ask groups like, what do you have in spreadsheets right now, right? Because that's a lot of times that's data that doesn't fit into a enterprise system like PeopleSoft or an HR hiring system, right? They're using a spreadsheet because there's nowhere else to put it. But they're already using Salesforce for cases. We're integrating all PeopleSoft HR, student data, everything in Salesforce. And so it's really in a lot of ways taking that spreadsheet, and it could just be a custom object with records in Salesforce. And all of a sudden you're not entering name and email, and you're not having, data issues with, spaces and lowercase and this and that. So we've seen some improvement, but it kind of depends on the group and the leadership um, in a lot of the cases.
Okay, Tom, how are you seeing the trend? Or is source of truth something that every university understands now, or is there still kind of like foundational battles to be fought?
I think this AI push has really forced a lot of teams and leadership teams at institutions to really think about what they're doing with their data, right? This is they've had time. We've all heard the buzzwords, and we all appreciate that there are resource constraints and time constraints and all of this. But as the mounting pressures are coming on CIOs from presidents and boards and things where they're like, why aren't we doing AI? Why aren't we doing these
Mm.
interesting, innovative things, particularly in light of the interesting climate we find ourselves in for higher ed? Um, really, it's becoming urgent, right? They're not going to get to that next level um, without doing some of these things, without really listening to their constituents and really thinking about it holistically. And that's becoming a challenge. I'll come back to the California state system once more. And I'm sure I'm grossly oversimplifying things. But again, years of challenges have resulted in several of the campuses having to merge administrative functions because of budgetary concerns. And leadership teams across the country are looking partially to technology to try and provide that student experience to help them kind of weather what's coming. So yeah, I think you know the tipping point has come, right?
Mm.
Now, data cleanliness and how we're ingesting this and what are we doing with it are now very important questions.
Yeah, I think that the value of having data that you can access and use, put to use, is becoming very clear. And ironically, I think AI agents in particular are showing that there's going to be hoops you need to jump through with your data in order to unlock some of that value. It's a bit of a forcing function. Not to jump ahead to the next webinar, but we'll be talking with Salesforce Ben about data quality specifically for preparing it for AI applications late next month. So if anyone in our audience, wants to, keep an ear to the ground for that, we'll be sending out invites for that later in May. Um, this has been a great conversation. I've seen a lot of the audience kind of jump into the chat and into our Q&A. And Brian, I know you've been doing a great job of kind of answering some of the questions that are aimed your way. But while we're talking about artificial intelligence. Mohammed had a question. They're looking ahead at predictive analytics. Do either of you have recommendations on how they can start building a framework specifically to, looking at those analytics? I think this will be more in that data cloud space than true agent force. But have either of you seen, the foundation for a predictive framework starting to be laid at any of the institutions you've worked with?
Yeah, I've started to see some of this. And again, it comes back to this kind of tipping point where AI is now important. Um, and I think the two big things that stand out to me that are now kind of leading these conversations are governance, and also, sort of under that, kind of data normalization, right? We're collecting these different data points in lots of different ways in lots of different places. And we have to be able to get that somewhere, normalize it in some fashion, and then begin to form some governance around that. I mentioned DevOps, creating feature sets for functionality, right? So maybe The institution can sit down as a group under governance practices and decide what does analytics mean to us, right? And you could develop that collectively, and then provide it as a package to the campus as a sort of a second generation managed package, which you can do internally without the app exchange. And now all of a sudden people are on the same playing field, which is when I think people are starting to see that potential of the data can really start to be tapped into.
I love that. Brian, anything at University of Florida on looking at predictive analytics?
I mean, for us, we're kind of on the front end of it, right? So we, you know, for that type of work, we'll push our Salesforce data out, and our data team will work on those requests. But for us, and using a tool like form assembly as opposed to manual entry and whatnot is right where we have clean data that is going to be able to be analyzed and used well, right? It's across all of our advising offices, a couple 100,000 cases a year. The same set of fields are going to be populated with pick list values, right? You're not going to be ingesting data that's all over the place. So what we really focus on is really trying to use forms, even instead of emails, right? Like we have 180 email to case addresses, but when we meet with groups, we say, please don't list your email address out there. Put a form so we can collect and ask 2, 3, 4 questions from the start. So you don't have to go back and forth. And then we can categorize that case. We can tie it to the right person. And so when we push that case data out, with all the other data, it's tied to a contact record, and that contact may have cases and other records. But when that data is out there in the data lake and they're trying to work on predictive analytics and whatnot, it's clean, and you can say, all right, here's this student, and they're tied to these 8 Salesforce records across 3 objects. And so we're kind of on the front end of that, but I think that's an important piece. Like Tom was mentioning, if you don't have good data, then all of this is going to be really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Garbage in, garbage out, to be very simplistic with it. Like that is something that we here at Form Assembly, because many people use our forms as kind of the gateway into their CRM. We're so closely tied to their Salesforce org that, like we are where those decisions are made of what is synced over and what isn't. And I think to your point, taking control of data quality as early in the process as possible is one way to, maybe it's not the framework that Mohammed was looking for, but it's one way to lay a foundation for eventually success with, like your data. And this question actually from Alexis, and Brian, don't let me stop you from answering over text, but they ask, how do you gather all the different streams of data? Like there are so many different places to get information. And if I can be so bold, Alexis, I think that's one of the value props that Form Assembly brings to universities is we're a place where you can host all of your forms, be it a simple RFI, be it something more complex that needs to, multiple pages, multiple fields. I think it's about using tools that allow you to pull your data intake streams into a single place so that you have visibility into them, that you have control over them. And as Brian mentioned, you can actually start putting numbers around things like how many people try to get in contact with a single department. It's very difficult to know what that looks like if you don't have a single solution in place to monitor that. Mohammed, you kind of asked this question that dovetails on this a bit, and it's how do you convince leadership to adopt new systems, especially something ready-made like a form assembly or another solution out there, rather than using in-house bandwidth, in-house teams when you have teams like that. And I know many universities do. I shouldn't answer this, but this is a question that comes up during form assembly sales process a lot, where it's like, hey, we want to build forms in-house. Why should we, like pay for a platform or bring that work into a different platform? And our answer is saving your team's bandwidth, usually for better projects, bigger projects, things that you can't accomplish with a ready-made tool. But I'm interested, Tom and Brian, I think this will probably be the last question we can get in today. Do you have any suggestions for, like convincing leadership to give your teams a tool that they need?
Yeah, I mean, for us, form assembly allows us to spin up forms really quickly. And also really anyone on our team can build those forms. And so occasionally projects will come along where, it's a pretty complicated project and we'll decide that form assembly of form is it's a little too much. And then we'll do some custom development. But it's kind of the Salesforce philosophy in general, right? It's clicks, not code. Like start and use, a declarative tool if possible. There's lots of advantages to that. And also, you know, many users on your team can build those forms as opposed to maybe a couple that could code something. So that's really our approach when it comes to that question.
Yeah, democratizing the tool. Tom, any suggestions for that last question? Working with leadership on tools that, maybe their teams need.
Yeah, for me, it's about right sizing it, right? Um, Leadership's going to be probably counting pennies for a while. So they probably need to understand what the business requirement is that you're asking for this question. And these days in particular, Education Cloud as a product from Salesforce comes with a lot of things. But that doesn't mean, for example, Omni Studio is necessarily a good replacement for form assembly because it is complicated. And that isn't to say it's bad, it's a different tool, right? There are different tools for different jobs. So if I want to put forms in the hands of someone who is less technical, who might be that accidental admin that you hear so much about in Salesforce world, I'm not giving them something complicated. They're not writing me code. They're not in Omni Studio. Flow might even be the wrong choice. In which case, spending the money for the right tool or the right services, for example, really can be of a huge benefit because then you can solve your problem rather than spinning your wheels a little bit and wasting money.
Yeah, agreed. Speaking of solutions like form assembly, I think Kate, do you mind popping our last poll just for our audience? If you have heard anything today that, I hope you learned something, first of all. My goal with bringing Brian and Tom in here was, to tackle some of the questions around challenges and solutions we're seeing in higher ed. But form assembly plays a role in this. And if you have any questions, if you'd like to just learn a little bit more about the platform, I'd love to have some of our team follow up with you. If you're interested, go ahead and answer this poll as yes. And if not, no worries. We'll send you the recording of this either way, and you can always get in contact with us on our own time. What I see valuable about form assembly in higher ed is just how many use cases we offer organizations. So if you have leadership, that are struggling with wanting to bring another platform, struggling with budget, there's a lot of efficiencies that you can unlock using platforms that are really tightly tied to the systems you already use, and also, of course, able to take on multiple processes and multiple forms and centralize that and get you better data. We do have some resources that we'll be sending out. We spend a lot of time thinking about the problems that you're experiencing in higher ed. We'd love to send you some information. Look for that in our follow-up emails as well. And of course, if you'd like to take, your own journey here, please head on over to formassembly.com. I've got webinars. We had a user conference recently that both Brian and Tom were involved in. If you'd like to hear more from them, there are sessions that you can hear from them recorded. And of course, you can get in contact with my team there as well. Brian and Tom, before I go today, I'd love to thank you both again for your expertise and for participating in this panel. And I'd love to give you an opportunity to say goodbye to our audience today.
Yeah, I appreciate being on, and hope everyone has a great week. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and happy to help.
Yeah, likewise. I've been part of this community now for a good 15 years. So I'm always happy to answer questions from anyone that I can help. So feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, and we can continue the conversation.
Excellent. Brian, Tom, thank you so much. Audience, thank you as well. And of course, reach out if you have any questions for Form Assembly. We'll see you in our next session.